yeah, Christian, why don't you start and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hey everyone, my name is Christian. Happy to be here with you today, and looking forward to an exciting little chat. Bit about myself. So I run a company called Customlytics together with my team here in Berlin. We're about 20 people, and we do consulting for all things about mobile marketing and technology. So everything you can imagine, from tracking to retention, app store optimization, product analytics, data warehousing, everything for mobile apps, so to say. So in other words, I think you can call us the more technical marketing people. Before that, I have already worked in mobile marketing here in Berlin at Delivery Hero. This is also where I met my co-founder. And yeah, whenever I talk about that, I feel pretty old because that was in the early days of mobile apps, and we were sitting there in performance marketing, buying installs, and at some point realized that all of the things we did were kind of inefficient, primarily for the lack of data, and that was kind of the starting point of why we have developed into this more like technical direction. And today, yeah, working with clients of all sizes and shapes, and yeah, excited to be here with you today.
Awesome. Mark, do you want to go next?
Sure. That was interesting to hear, Christian. I remember those days myself. I'm old enough to remember the early app days, .com boom. My name's Mark Waddoups. I'm a senior product manager at Western Governors University here in the United States. We're currently the #1 online competency-based university in the country, completely online. We have different offices around the United States, regional offices, but all of our classes are offered online. I've been in product management for, wow, some time now, and excited to be here today to talk a little bit about web analytics. I started out my career as a web analyst and really started to see the benefit that more than the data itself, I began to see how it could track behavior. And so I started out with some early tools and started getting into how you could better create a customer experience through that, through those applications. So just happy to be here.
Awesome. I'm glad that you guys are here as well. My name is Jonas. Today I will be more in the background. I'm doing marketing at UXCam. UXCam is a market leader for qualitative in-app analytics. We work with big brands to improve their user experience, and I'm happy to get started. So let's start by defining the problem that you want to solve today first. So the problem is people don't know what to measure. So how do you come across, or come across that problem in your own work, Christian and Mark?
Yeah, I think when I first started, especially as I moved into a product management role, it was just really difficult to know where to start. I think the images we've got here, kind of illustrate that. You feel like you're getting drowned in a lot of information on the left if you do have tools that you have access to. But on the right side, even if you do try and focus, a lot of times you're wondering, hey, what do I start with? How do I get started? And I think we'll talk a little bit about that today.
I guess from my side, very similar thing. So I think what you can see here is illustrations of myself anno 2013. When we were, as I said, in performance marketing, and we were having like all those nice budgets and spilling out money for buying app installs, but we barely had any idea of what we were doing, and then not even talking about what to measure. I think for us, it then came from the perspective of, okay, kind of we knew how marketing works. So that was kind of helping us in defining what to start looking at in terms of which metrics and which KPIs. Of course, later on we have realized that there's much more to it, and there's like completely different worlds between what you look at for marketing analytics and what you look at for product analytics, which is not the topic for today, but also an interesting one for maybe another webinar. I think at some point we've realized that the questions you're asking are just very different between the two, and that you have to come up with something that caters for, well, the question you're asking. On the product side, where it's always more about understanding what users are doing in the product. On the marketing side, it's always more towards understanding where users are coming from and why they started using web. And this is kind of how we solved it in the end.
Okay, great. And basically, I want to give you a bit of a teaser of what we want to present today. So when we first got together and discussed what we want to do with this webinar, the one thing that we agreed upon is that we want something actionable, that we want something that you viewers can apply to your everyday work, and we really try to give you, insights that you can apply easily. And basically what we're going to talk about today is, first of all, we're going to show you some proven frameworks that will give you a starting point on what to measure. Then we'll show you a template for a customer-centric sheet that you can use to finalize your KPIs. And Mark was really kind, and we will send you all the templates that we mentioned here today afterwards via email. Then Christian is going to tell you how you choose the fitting analytics tools after you know what to measure, and how you set up your tech stack in a way that allows you to track your KPIs in the most accurate way. So how do you know what to measure? Really general question. Maybe you guys want to talk about that a bit.
I'll go ahead and start off. Early in my career, I started off in e-commerce, so kind of a little bit more towards what Christian's background is. And I think you have to start with asking it's a simple question, but what's the problem you're trying to solve? What are the key outcomes that you're really looking for? And I know that sounds simple, and when I say that, everyone's probably says, yeah, of course, but it oftentimes gets lost when you start looking at data. So you need to, I think at the very beginning, it's important to, we'll talk about at least some ways that I've done this. I think Christian's going to talk about that as well, but you need to sit down and just start asking some fundamental questions. What are the things that are going to make your business or help you achieve your goals? But more around what are those questions? Is it revenue? Are you trying to increase the revenue? In a case like WGU, where we provide educational material, it may not be revenue based, but we do have some goals and outcomes to help our students graduate faster.
Christian, what's your general approach to this question?
Yeah, very similar. Minus maybe the education aspect, because that's something that's not too common with our clients. But in like general business terms, it's the same. For us, it always starts even way before we talk about which tools to use and helping them integrating, helping setting up all like the nice, sunshine bright land where everything's possible. Even before that, way before that, we start asking, okay, what are the questions that we want to answer in the end even? And that for our projects always essentially looks like, okay, what are the departments in the company? You will almost always have something like management on top that has their own kind of questions, typically more like top level. In a lot of cases, it's like top level revenue, top level sales, purchases, subscriptions. Is the kind of the amount of that is the big question that they have. But then kind of trickles down like a bit of a waterfall into all the different departments. And on the department level, then the questions are very different. There you have all of a sudden, like I already mentioned, two of them, marketing and product, where marketing is more about where are users coming from, how successful are my campaigns, how much am I paying for an app install to put it into the app context, what are users kind of bringing in, what's the return, how much revenue do they generate after I acquired them on some paid activity. Then you have product. Product is more interested typically in the overall like vitality and conversion rate inside of the product. So they care about, okay, from all the sessions that I have, how many make a purchase? How can I improve this? Where do they drop off? Where does my app crash? This kind of metrics or figures. And then there might be other departments, like if you have direct sales, then those guys have also different metrics to look at. If you have customer care, they have different metrics to look at, like how long does it take to close a case, what's the response time, and there's kind of the questions where we start, and like after that we kind of end up with a clear image on this is the metrics that we need to answer those questions, and then you can start talking about tools, not the other way around. Actually.
Great insight. Cool. Next, I want to ask Mark a question and jump into bits of like practical insights on how you guys are doing it at WGU. So how does the top level process at WGU look like when it comes to finding out what to measure?
I think we have a set, we have some set objectives that we get from our management, just overall kind of business type metrics. But I think as a product manager, we're all responsible, each of us product managers, for measuring what we're trying to accomplish with our particular product. So we start around, as you've got listed here, just brainstorming around what are those business questions. In our case, if you have what your outcomes are, then you need to start asking, then how does this product tie into that? So Christian kind of talked about it. For each department, it's a little bit different. If I'm in customer service, then maybe the specific questions that I'm going to be asking to obtain my outcomes for my department. If it's customer service, maybe it's the number of clients that I'm able to help, and that ties back into the objectives of the company in increasing satisfaction, or there may be some cost savings there. That's I think where you start first. Then I think you have to, from there, you've got to now look at what are the signals that are going to tell me that I'm actually hitting that objective. So you can have a great business question, but how are you going to know whether that's going to be the case? If we talk about customer service, it may be the signals are, maybe it's the number of calls, like we talked about, that I service in a particular month per agent. I think that's just one that comes to mind. Then you have to go back and look at, okay, what's the actual, if that's the signal, what's the actual metric that I'm going to use to do that? I kind of combined in my example number 2 and 3, but it may be the signal is the number of calls, and now the corresponding metric is for what's the average number of calls that a particular agent can service, and how many are they servicing, right? And then,
and then
go ahead.
You defined, after we defined the process, like what frameworks do you use at WGU to measure data?
So I use what I would call it's the HEART model, and the HEART framework was essentially created by Google because they had some other frameworks they were using that didn't quite measure the outcomes that they were looking to use. And so I stumbled across this as I was struggling to find a way to make sure that I was getting a complete picture for my for my product and for the customers and users using my product. So I'll dive into this a little bit more, but you start with that. And then I just created this, what I call a customer-centric map, where I found a framework for me to be able to make sure that I was focusing on the true performance indicators that were going to move the needle for the business or objectives. I created that map, and then out of that was able to decide on, okay, these are the ones that I want to focus on, just so that I'm not drowning in a bunch of data that doesn't mean anything, right? Or what I would call vanity metrics. Sometimes if you've got a website and you're talking about the number of page views that you've gotten on your website, that's great, but is it really helping you to achieve the objectives of your company or your goals?
Yeah, that's great. And let's jump into those frameworks directly. So maybe you can say a few words about the HEART framework.
Yeah, so the HEART framework, it's an acronym that stands for happiness, engagement, adoption, retention, and task success or health. And this is what Google determined. There's some follow-up material there if you want to read it. There's a paper that the author goes through and kind of explains this in greater detail. But I really like this because it helps you to get or categorize in a broad view what you should be measuring. Happiness may be you may be able to have what's called a net promoter score, or something that, how satisfied are your customers with a particular product. And so these then become different buckets or areas in which you can focus.
Great. Yeah, and we will send out, like I said, all the follow-up material via email after the session. So let's jump into how do you actually apply this framework at WGU, and we have some practical example here.
Okay. So here I just, this is basically just a matrix. I created this in a spreadsheet from some material that I'd come across. And if you start first with, say, goals, if you want to click that, if you want to go to the next piece there, there's an example in the happiness bucket, or, when you're trying to measure user attitude or user satisfaction. My goal was to improve the user satisfaction of the mobile app. As Christian pointed out, we're a little bit different than, say, a typical revenue or e-commerce shop. So in my case, I'm really trying to improve the satisfaction for our students. So then you look at that and say, okay, so how am I going to be able to measure that? What is going to be a signal that's going to show that I'm going to improve the user satisfaction or achieving that? And in this case, we have App Store reviews. So our app is available in both the Apple and the Google Store. So then I take a look at that and say, okay, what's the metric then that is going to help me to measure that? And in this case, it would be just star rankings, right? This is just a simple or easy example that hopefully everyone can relate with. It's used a mobile app, but that's the intention then, is to map that from what's the goal down to what's the metrics you're using. And then I've added frequency and target, because I think the target represents what outcome you're trying to achieve. What's that target you're trying to reach that you can measure your success from? And frequency then would just be how often it makes sense for your organization to be measuring that. And you can see here in each of the different areas, here's some examples of things that I'm doing in each of these areas. You can have multiple pieces or multiple goals for a particular area, say engagement, but this framework allows you to kind of brainstorm and get really focused on the specific analytics or metrics that are going to make a difference. I would say that not every metric is equal. Some that you measure are going to give you more information, and if you keep it simple and focused there, that's where I think you're most successful.
Awesome. And like I said, we will send this framework over to you so that you can also apply it on your own app. So next, you mentioned the customer-centric map, which is kind of your own creation. So maybe you want to quickly jump into that. And can you tell me how you, in general, structured this map?
Yeah, at first glance, this can be kind of confusing, but maybe this is kind of my twisted mind or a way to be able to stay focused. It's easy for me to get really curious about different metrics. So what I try to do is just start with, like I said, created this spreadsheet to say, here are the different categories in, say, column A, and just start out asking your questions. It really is about brainstorming and saying, what are the objectives that my department, or in this case, my product, what are the objectives I'm trying to achieve? So I even created that, section that you've got there highlighted, just to keep track of the questions that I was asking. And I would just say to viewers here, don't be afraid to spend some time just brainstorming on different questions. you can always come back and look at these questions and say, yeah, is this one really as important compared to this other question? And from there, you can then go back and start, defining what the goals you're trying to achieve. And then, as we talked about before, then I try and look at, hey, what signals or what information is available to me today, or can I go get in, in that, in the signal area. And then that helps you focus on what are the specific types of metrics you can get. So you can see in this example, I've got quite a few here listed, but the one that probably makes the greatest difference, or is the biggest factor if I had to rank these, would be column, I think that's column number 3, the student satisfaction and the star rating that we talked about.
Awesome.
So that's how I, hopefully that makes sense to our viewers, but that's how I go through and do this, is I just try and go through and map this out so that I can not only trace back to the questions I'm trying to answer, but it allows me to, on a fairly regular basis, to come back and say, do these metrics still make sense? Are they helping me to measure whether I'm successful or not?
Awesome. That's great. And thank you for sharing that with the viewers. That's awesome. Cool. Also, the next question is my favorite question. So how do you use UXCam to track your metric?
Yeah, this is one example, right? UXCam allows you to see, in this example, the different paths through your product. And this is helpful whether if you're in an e-commerce or revenue generation type model. This is really helpful to see which paths are helping you to convert. For our organization, this is helpful in being able to see where are the areas that people are using our solution. So are there specific areas? And you'll get a pretty good picture, an idea of normal user behavior. You had an image earlier that you were showing that kind of had somebody's face there that was made out of a lot of different numbers. And the one thing I really like about metrics is as you start to put these together, it starts to give you an idea of what users are doing. And so, UXCam helps me to be able to get those metrics and start forming kind of a picture of what people are doing. One area that I really like to use UXCam for is the recording, session recordings, because we can actually see not just the path, but we can also drill down into specific users and see, what are they doing through the app. You can see the actual clicks and pushes. Our developers right now are using it to, as student satisfaction is a big measure for us, they're using that as a way to identify what users were doing when they experienced a crash in our app. That then allows us to come back and say, okay, how can we fix these particular areas to improve the satisfaction of our for our customers?
Great, thank you, Mark. The next question I have for you guys, for both of you, is how do you choose your analytics tools? What's your general approach there?
Actually, if I might have a nice little story about the metric questions, the sort of one from the previous chapter.
Sure.
Probably interesting for the audience. I guess the slide that would fit best to this is the table that you showed, where we have all the different kind of metrics to look at. So one nice little story that I always tell, exactly this one. One nice little story that I always tell from a specific client project that we had is, if you so you do this exercise and you end up with a lot of different questions to answer, and then kind of metrics and KPIs derived from this. And when you do this which is typically the case in the business context, when you do this on this per department level, where you go there and say, okay, I have marketing and product and customer service and whatnot. one very important takeaway is that you still have to see, or like there has to be somebody in the organization that has the bigger picture of how all those metrics go together, because in a very big company, or even doesn't have to be that big, just have to be confused. In bigger companies, what can happen is that the goals that a specific department has are like outright contradicting the goals of another department. In the sense that, you know, there's this, then all of a sudden there's the head of product defining whatever goals for his team, and then there's the head of marketing defining whatever goals for his team, and then, you know, 3 more heads in the room defining whatever goals. And the funny story that we always tell there is that so we had this project where everything was very like clearly defined with OKRs, so those like objective quarterly results, key results, and everything was super defined. Everybody like laser focused on the goals of his or her department. And one of the goals, and was an app business, one of the goals that the product team had was to maximize the conversion rate from people that visit the app store page, so the store presence, to people that would actually install the app. So maximize that conversion rate, because of course that's a great product metric, and it's kind of in their interest to not lose people in the app store. And what they did then is making up their minds of how they can kind of achieve this goal. And they've looked at the traffic sources that are coming to the product pages, and that business was quite heavy on paid advertising. And quite quickly, they've realized that the traffic that is having the worst conversion rate in the store from visit to install was the paid traffic, because of course this is paid users that have for some reason hit the ad, but have less of an intent to install the app versus the organic ones. So the product team went there and said, okay, how can we get rid of this stream of low conversion rate traffic? We just have to get rid of marketing. And how do you get rid of marketing? Exactly, let's just screw up the tracking. If we screw up the tracking, marketing cannot do campaigns anymore, and all of a sudden our conversion rate will go through the roof. And that's what they did. So they broke the tracking in the app, the install tracking, so that the, well, marketing was still existent but couldn't do any campaigns anymore because they couldn't measure it. Goal achieved. So yeah, always a nice story of how it's important to still keep the overarching, like, bigger picture in mind when you look at metrics, especially on this like business per department view.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that's an excellent, I love that story. It's an excellent example. And I can think of cases in the past where, because you aren't focused on those business questions, it's quite honestly a big reason why I created that extra column for what's the business question you're trying to answer, because it does make sure that you can go back and defend and you're not cannibalizing or ruining other departments, right? You got to be aligned to the business goal. That's a great, love that story.
Yeah, I think it's also like a great reminder that, you know, if you create those metrics, share them with others, be sure that everyone is aligned. Cool. Back to the analytics tool question. Any comments on that one? How do you choose your analytics tools?
I can go first. I have the suspicion that I will have the biggest talking part in this anyway, so I will maybe I'll say a few words, and then Mark, you can add something before I get to my monologue mode.
Sure.
Yeah, how to choose your analytics tools. Two implications, or like two meta implications again. One is, so what's the actual question you want to answer? What is the purpose of the analytics tool? Because you're not getting an analytics tool without a purpose, or at least you shouldn't. Not saying it's not done, but you shouldn't. So that's the first thing. And what I mean by that is the question of, hey, what do I even want to measure? Is it the source of the install? Oh, great, you have to get an attribution tracking tool. Is it user behavior inside of the app on a very big scale? Oh, we're a lot more talking about quantitative analytics. Is it figuring out how one single user is moving throughout the app? Well, then it's more like qualitative stuff, and you should probably look at something like UXCam. So this is the one meta question in that regard. And the second one is at what time of the, and when I talk about all of this, I'm always talking about mobile apps because that's kind of what we are so deep into. So everything I say is in the mobile app context. And any mobile app has this life cycle. So any mobile app has this any product on that, by that matter, has this life cycle where at some point the product's developed, and at some point it's released into the wild. In the beginning, you will not have a lot of users. Then by doing something, or also sometimes by doing nothing, you gain users. The user base grows and grows and grows and grows. And then for some products, not all of them, but for some products, of course, at some point you also have the discontinuation for different reasons. And the main point that I want to make here is that the requirements that you're looking at do change throughout the life cycle of an app. And that means that in the beginning, when you're just starting out and you don't have a lot of users, and most likely the UX of your app product is also probably not going to be perfect, because what you came up with is like the first, typically in the beginning, the UX, especially if you haven't done extensive user research before, the UX of your product will most likely not be perfect. And to a large degree, it will be like kind of the first attempt, and then you kind of look at iterations from there. So let's say your app is just being launched. You have the first version is out. You made up your mind about how the user flow should look like, but most likely it's not going to be perfect. What you need in terms of an analytics tool at that point is more what we would count under the qualitative analytics. So looking at single users moving through the app, understanding which screens they are viewing after the other, how they flow. So this like the diagram that we looked at before with user flows, there was from UXCam, or even the screen recording stuff where you can really go there and see, oh, this is what users are doing inside of the app. Exactly, this one. So this, in the beginning, this will help you immensely in figuring out the biggest problems that you have in your kind of in your user flow. So this is what you need in the beginning. In the beginning, you need qualitative analytics, because you will just not have a lot of data, which is kind of the definition of quantitative analytics. So this is where you start. And what happens then is that you iron out the biggest problems in the UX of your products. And then the usual 80-20 rule applies. So in the first 20% of the efforts that you put in, you will already get 80% of the return in terms of how you can improve your product, how you can improve the conversion rate of your product. And kind of on the time scale, as you move on, you will also have more and more users. And once you get to the point where you really have a lot of users in your app, then it also becomes almost like so you will not be able to even look at all the qualitative data anymore, like all the single sessions from a user anymore, because you just have so many users. And that's the point when you get into the quantitative side of things. This is when, again, you have ironed out the biggest problems in the UX of your product, and you get to the part where you look at aggregated, bigger amounts of data to understand how users are behaving and what you can still improve on the product. So this is in a nutshell, without having an even longer monologue, how we always approach it. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I think just to add to Christian's comments, I think, look at, I would say, if you're coming into an established organization, especially, and even if you're very small, let's say you're kind of in a lean startup type mode, look at what you have available today. Whether it's a web, whether it's a mobile analytics tool, or you have other data, see what you can do to just get your hands on some of that data. See what's available today, whether it's a tool or just information that's being stored in a database, because sometimes you're going to have to make the case for why you need to have an analytics tool specific to mobile, like UXCam is. So I would just say that. Also, the other thing I would say is make sure that as you're selecting some type of a tool, just make sure that you're really focused on as few of solutions as possible. You want most of the data as much as possible in one tool so that you can go in and get that information, and you don't have the problem that you can sometimes have where different tools might measure it differently. It's more important that you're benchmarking off of a specific number, and then you can measure your improvement or decline, and that allows you to move forward. It's what I would call turning analytics into business intelligence, where you can actually start making some decisions off of that, just like Christian was explaining.
Okay, great. Thank you for the input. Maybe we want to quickly, Christian, you want to quickly also tell us, now that we know what metrics to track, which tools to use, how do we actually set up analytics in a really short way so that we don't overtime too much, and also have time for the questions of the viewers?
Yeah, happy to do that. Thanks for bringing up the slide. Exactly. So what I've brought for today, because I always think that webinars like this should have some actionable takeaways and ideally some steps that you can kind of hold on to for whatever process we're looking at. So here we're looking at an exemplary process of how a tool integration would look like that we do for whatever given client on the analytics side of things. So imagine client comes in, doesn't have an analytics tool, and we go there and say, okay, this is the necessary steps to get your analytics game up to speed. So it all starts in step number 1, which is the requirement step. Requirement step is, well, all of the things that we've talked about in this webinar already. It's figuring out what I actually need in a tool. What are the use cases I want to have it for? Again, do I want to understand where users are coming from, where they install the app, where they're in the attribution tracking? Do I want to have more like on the user flow screen recording side of things? Then I might more need something like the UXCam. So answer those questions, nail it down to the tool that you need, or sometimes also the set of tools with all the implications that one has. And then essentially decide on what tool it should be. Next up, and that holds true for, well, all the possible tools I can think of in the analytics space, is that you need a proper definition of what you want to track. Because yes, of course, you can throw in the SDK of whatever tool you've selected, and that's all nice. But without tracking the right events and parameters to kind of describe the user behavior that's occurring in the app, you will be lost. This is one of the major points. And also in almost all cases where we get in, when there's some setup already existing and like client complains that, oh, my analytics my analytics setup is wrong or is broken, I need to replace the tool. In the majority of the cases, the tool is not the problem. It's the way it has been set up, because the most important events are missing or they are fired in the wrong way. So this is very important point. Step number 2 is really define what you want to track. What events do you need to track to describe the user behavior? So like can be obvious stuff like the purchase, but then also what leads to a purchase. Is there a login? Can users visit the profile? All this kind of questions, depending on what app it is. Next up, that's something that we've learned the hard way. Step number 3 is now you have defined what requirements you have. You've defined the tool. You've defined what to track. Now you have to put all of this together into something like an integration manual, even I would call it. It's like similar to a product ticket, really, where you write down which kind of steps are needed, or what has to be integrated into the app. So from motivation, why you need a tool, so that your developers are not, getting back to you being like, oh, but I don't understand why we need this, which they shouldn't do anyways, but okay. To like which part of the SDK have to be implemented, what features do I need? Again, the events, they are popping up here again. This is where you should always also like include them. And also a very important point, include what is the acceptance criteria of that integration. So acceptance criteria, if you are the marketing guy and you put this together, acceptance criteria is, oh, the SDK is functioning when the app is open. Something like this. And of course, many more. The reason why you have to define this so clearly is that otherwise it can happen that your developers do something, but then they don't implement 9 out of 10 of the features that you need. And if there's no acceptance criteria to hold them accountable for it, time wasted. Step number 4 then is the obvious part. It's the integration by the developers. So your developers have to go there and put whatever was defined into the app. Step number 5, what we always really like to keep at least to some degree on the side of the marketing or product, by that matter, people as well, is the QA. So step number 5 is running a manual QA of whatever has been integrated against the acceptance criteria that was defined before, to really check that the developers have done what you wanted them to do. Because, well, it's quite a common scenario that developers work on something and there's a product ticket and they see all of that, all the requirements, they do something and then put it to done. And I'm done with that. SDK is integrated, nice. But then again, half of the features are missing. So that's why we always recommend doing the QA on the side of the team that is requiring the tool integration. So marketing for marketing analytics stuff, product and product analytics stuff, to also kind of have this kind of emancipation thing where you can talk to the developers on the same level, because you can tell them, oh, yeah, you say you've implemented this, but I can prove you that you didn't. So please revisit the integration ticket. Once that is done, you can kind of sign off the integration and go there and say, yep, it's done. I'm happy with it. It works just as I wanted it to be. And then next up, you have the actual usage of the tool. So this is the part where everybody has been waiting for. Now you also know, because you did the QA, you can also know for sure that the data integrity is like perfect and the data is coming in as you expected. And now it's only a matter of using whatever tool you have selected and kind of setting it up in the way to answer the questions you had initially. So there you have it, 6 steps to set up a product analytics tool.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Just to summarize real quick, like I said, you will get all those materials and the slides at the end of the webinar. So to summarize, what did we discuss? So you start brainstorming with the HEART model. Then you define the signals and metrics in a customer-centric sheet to have everything in one place, and a place to brainstorm even further. Then you always should use, obviously in my opinion, quantitative and qualitative analytics to get a more complete insight. And you should really take care of your analytics setup and do it properly. And I think the steps that Christian mentioned are really great, and you should really follow them, because there are a lot of things that can go wrong if you don't do it properly, in my opinion. The next step, the last part of this webinar is Q&A. So I think the chat is open, so you can all ask your question. Just to start, while I pull up the chat, question from Chandrakant. Chandrakant, if you're in the chat, you can say hi. And his question is, when we discuss about KPIs and what to measure, it varies from stakeholder to stakeholder. And how do we measure the impact of that on the decision on what to measure?
Yeah, I think I'll go first and then let Christian respond. But I think that's why it's so important to go back and make sure that, that you're looking at what your business or your organization's goals are. That the KPIs don't mean a whole lot if you're not looking at what type of outcomes you're trying to achieve. If you're not aligned on what those outcomes are, you may have some that are department focused, but you really want to, in that spreadsheet I was showing, the whole reason I created that business, what business questions are you trying to answer is to make sure that you are aligned to this, so that once you're done brainstorming, you can go back and say, okay, which one of these questions is most critical to what I understand as the strategy of what we're trying to do in the end. And usually, even if that isn't specifically defined, you usually have a pretty good idea of, hey, what are we trying to do, right? And if you don't, then you're going to have to start there first and understand that, or you're just tracking metrics to track metrics. I don't know if you have some thoughts there, Christian, on that.
Oh no, I think this question is pretty much what we had in the nice little anecdote story that I told. It's like, it's very important to keep an overview of like the bigger picture. That's why you have to really understand how the different metrics interact with each other. Again, red alarm lights if there is metrics put as goals for departments that contradict each other even. So yeah, I think this is a rule of thumb. This is probably one of the more important things to keep in mind. And other than that, it's like in terms of what's the most important like strategic thing to look at, it's the stuff that's most important to management, because that's typically the top level kind of one North Star goal that the company has, which is in a lot of cases, as we've discussed, revenue or some other form of monetary value. So.
Yeah, and if you don't know, I would say go ask your management. Like, there's a couple of cases in my experience where I wasn't really clear. So, you know, feel free. I would just suggest that you go talk to your immediate management and ask them some of these questions if you don't understand, because that can only be a positive thing.
Good. So we have a lot of questions coming in right now. Guys, by the way, if we don't get to your question, I will keep them in mind and follow up with you via email and try to give you an answer. So I think one interesting question that just came in from Ahmad was, can data itself not shape our business question? What do you guys think?
Good point. I'll let you go first, Christian.
Well, I think it does in a lot of cases. I think it does in a lot of cases, especially if you have this scenario. I think Mark brought it up at some point where it's not green field and this, like, you know, traditional life cycle of we're just starting out and everything's green field and I can do whatever I like. I think in most scenarios, when you get into a company and some setup of sorts already exists for tracking analytics, then in a lot of cases that is the case. You look at the data that's there and then kind of retrospectively derive the questions from it that you want to have answered. Is it the right thing to do? Not so sure. I think it doesn't hurt to look at any, like, if you are sure that the data integrity is good and that you can trust the data, it definitely doesn't hurt to look at what is coming in already when you are in the process of defining what questions you even want to have answered. But I think in terms of like general practice, I would say the other way around is probably the way you want to go, to have it like not biased by whatever data is already coming in. I don't know, what do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that you can look at this one of two ways. One, yeah, you know, I think I can totally relate, having implemented a couple of different, on the technical side, a couple of different solutions in my past. You do have to always question the data. But I do think if you're coming in and you do have an analytics tool, go ahead and look at that. I mean, one of the things that I think analytics tools does for you is it doesn't always give you answers, but it gives you better questions to ask, if that makes sense. So as I look at, you know, some of what's available in a existing analytics tool, whether it's accurate or not, it may actually spur or give you some ideas of what you should be measuring. So, you know, I think Christian's point about making sure your implementation is right, I couldn't agree with that more. I've been burned with that. You really do, you kind of learn from your experience on what events that you're tracking and what have you. But I would just say, take a look at what you do have and just go with it with the lens of what are the questions that I should be asking. And so that may give you an idea to do on what you should be looking for in addition to anything you may have come up with.
Okay,
That's my thoughts.
We're a bit over time now. Do you guys have time for more questions, or do you have any other?
Yeah, I'm good.
I can take one or two more.
Okay, awesome. Then one question from Kanan Ertug, I hope I pronounced that right, is which one is better, KPI or OKR in terms of metrics? So I guess the question that he's asking is, should you just look at KPIs or should you use the OKR framework?
I can go first, Christian, if you want. To me, it's not an either or, it's an and. OKRs, objectives and key results, are really what you're trying to get as an outcome. And it's those outcomes that then drive what metrics you should be asking. So rather than should I be measuring KPIs or OKRs, I would say you need to look at what your OKRs are and derive your KPIs out, or decide on what KPIs are going to help you measure your outcomes.
Yeah, like 100%. I think in all of the so-called data-driven companies today, OKRs, like the majority of OKRs, if it's not stuff like, yeah, I don't know, do this or that learning video on Photoshop, are almost always measured by some KPIs. So it's not an either or. It's more that, like, you know, OKRs typically put in place to achieve something, and then that something is quantified by some metric or KPI. So it's not an either or.
Well said.
Okay, great. Victoria asked a great question. She asks, what is the one key benefit for a startup that invests into UXCam? How will it increase our profits? Your app will increase like 1000%. That's Mark, what do you think? What do you think is the one key benefit?
Can you repeat the question again?
She asks, what is the one key benefit that for a startup that invests into UXCam? I mean, I think we touched on this in the webinar.
Yeah, I would say that the benefit is that you start to get an idea of what your customers are doing. You know, Christian touched on this. You can get qualitative data, and an example of that would be a survey or something like that. The problem is that oftentimes people will tell you what you want to hear, and what they actually do sometimes is different than what they say. And a tool like UXCam allows you to see what people are actually doing. You know, like a real quick story that I used to use is web analytics tools allow you, let's say we use the analogy of going into a supermarket. And you go into the supermarket and you go and you pick up, let's say you pick up in the United States, we have Campbell's and Progresso soup. And if you go and somebody goes down aisle 3 and picks up Campbell soup and looks at the label and says, oh, that's great, puts it back, and then picks up the Progresso soup and looks at the Progresso soup and then goes and checks out. You may be able to, in this analogy, to see what they purchased, but as a product manager or somebody who's looking at analytics, I'm almost more interested in the fact that they picked up the Campbell soup and put it back. What was it about the Campbell soup that they didn't like, but they did like with Progresso? And if we go back to an analytics tool, it allows you to be able to see, if you set up your analytics right, where somebody went, where they dropped out, where you have some of your greater conversion rates. And so now you can get a picture of, wow, more of the customers and people coming to my site seem to be wanting this. Now I can focus my efforts towards that. I think that's a big benefit, especially when you're a small company and you've got, you know, time to revenue is really, really important.
Awesome. Then Christian, I think this would be a good question for you also. The question is from Tusha. In the e-commerce app, how do you identify dead spots where customer taps do not happen, or areas which do not get traffic?
Different ways of doing that. One of them is exactly the chart that I think Mark had in one of his slides with the flow through the different screens. What's the right word for it? Is that the sunburst, or I'm always mixing it up? Which is the sunburst diagram? Well, the one with the user flow that you had before. That's one way to figure that out. If you see a lot of users ending up in one screen but then not going to another, of course you have to have the tracking in place to know that. And the other thing is, the other way how you can tell it is indeed with something like this screen recording feature that also UXCam offers, where you can I always call it a bit like user testing minus the awkwardness because they know or they are in the same room with you. Because that's a big problem with user testing. Mark has kind of briefly touched on it. The big problem with user testing is that regardless of how you do it, it will never be natural behavior, because like either you sit in the same room with the person and they have to talk, or they are filmed by some camera, or they know that they are being monitored. So that's why you will never get unbiased kind of results from that, which is a pity. But and also interesting how that is like still the like hugely like still the widely used practice. And that's something you don't have with the screen recording, that you can do with tools like UXCam, where users are behaving naturally and you can actually understand where they are dropping off. And you can understand if they're hitting something that looks like a button to them, but is not a button. There's no way you can tell that with like, even with like quantitative event tracking data with like, I have this and that amount of events. Well, event tracking always only shows you what the known knowns with events that you have defined before, but it doesn't show you when somebody's clicking on something that's not defined as in like an event. So there are two things: the screen recording side of things, or this other visualization where you just see that they are going nowhere after a certain screen.
Awesome. Do you want to do one more, two more, three more? We have 3 more questions here. What do you guys think?
Can do one or two.
Yep, agreed. 1 or 2 more.
Okay. Let's see. I think this was a good one. Even though like. So I think this one, just quickly want to say here, what KPIs would you recommend for a free app targeting parents of 0 to 14-year-old children? I think if you're watching this, just follow the process that we showed you earlier, and I think you will naturally come up with some KPIs. And there's not really an answer. You have to kind of figure it out by yourself. So I think that answers.
By the way, if that is supposed to be an app, then things will get very interesting, because the stores these days are somewhat restrictive about ad-based revenue models for kids apps, but you probably are aware. I don't know if that's supposed to be an app business. Oh, it says app. So yeah, be careful about the kids categories, because they are like any ad-related stuff is borderline not possible, including tracking. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah,
Can I make a little bit related comment to this? I think Christian and the material that we've shown here does a good job of showing that quantitative and how you want to go about doing that. I think as Christian mentioned, too many times people will use user testing or some kind of focus group in the wrong way. I don't think focus groups are bad at all. You just have to put the analytics you're seeing together with what you're asking for a user group. And a user group should be focused more on the why they do certain things. And as long as you're not asking them, hey, would you choose A or B, but more you're asking the questions of why are you doing this, then I think that helps you. So when I look at this question, you may want to say, yeah, I want to be able to track how people are, how many people, for instance, are clicking on a particular app or something of that nature. But you also want to make sure you're doing some interviews, in my opinion, of some people that fit this demographic to find out what they're really interested in. Are they going to click on that? What kind of content are you going to offer that's going to make this successful? And then you can tailor you can start looking in your analytics tool for those type of things instead of, this high level view that you get lost in data.
Awesome. Yeah, good
but
point.
to still I think we miss out on that a bit. But so to answer the question, if it's ad impression based revenue, then the high level, the most important KPI is ads consumed. To kind of answer that outside of all the comments that we had.
Yeah, you're right.
Awesome. Okay, last question for today. So these are actually I think 2 questions. I think the second one is the easiest to answer. What are some answers we should look for in data? Also, do we have any common behavior patterns that can be identified by mobile analytics, like F and Z pattern for the reader on the web? So he's referring to, I think that's with eye tracking that people read websites in F pattern.
Yeah, that's to me, like if we take like the second question, what are some answers we should be looking for in data? I think we've covered a lot of, examples or areas that people should be looking at. To me, quite honestly, what I do is I try and play around with what data's in there. Just budget out some time once you know that your analytics solution is set up correctly, in that step process that Christian presented. Play around. If you don't have specific data that you should be looking at based off the framework we talked about, then if you're looking for additional data outside of that, just go in and play around with it. Like I said before, for me, an analytics tool gives me better questions to answer or better questions to ask, if that makes sense. So as I look at a particular piece of data, and I'm seeing, like in the user flow map that you had that we showed earlier, if people are dropping out at, say, stage 3 or 4 in some type of flow that you want to increase conversions, then why are they dropping out there? Now maybe I can go back and start looking at some other data, or I can go back to my developers and say, hey, I want to track this particular event, and help me understand. It may be like we're going to try an alternate flow, and I want to compare the old flow with this new flow and see if it works. Experiment. I don't know if you have any extra thoughts on that, Christian.
The only extra thought that I guess I have towards the latter part of the question here is that, well, I think the equivalent of the most interesting thing in terms of behavior patterns that is kind of unique to mobile devices because they have touch screens is this concept of heat maps for where users would click or like tap with their finger on the screen. That's kind of the equivalent of the heat map that we know for mouse clicks on the web. That's interesting to look at. That's something you should be doing if you want to figure out like what users actually do inside of your app product. Again, something we need a tool like UXCam for. I guess that's as close as it gets to that, and I think it's an interesting exercise. It can show you very interesting findings, like again dead spots where people click but there's nothing to click, and stuff like this.
Yeah, or even rage taps, where what they call rage taps, where somebody just keeps clicking on something. That may be a identification, for instance, of an area that you need to improve the performance of your app.
Yeah.
Awesome, cool. I think we have like 2 more questions that we didn't answer yet, but I think we are already over time, so I will get back to you guys via email. But I want to thank you both for being here. I think it was an awesome session. I think the viewers got a lot of insights from you. Any last words? Anything that you want to leave the viewers with?
I would just say, keep it simple. Start simple. Too often, it gets overwhelming when you get, like we were talking about at the beginning of the webinar. I think both Christian and I can relate in our careers to times where we're like, some of the same questions. What do I measure? Where do I start? Just start simple. Start with what are the high level objectives of your organization and maybe even your department, and then just start there and start measuring. As you start with something really simple, you'll start to discover other metrics that may be helpful as you go. But too often you get stuck in analysis paralysis and you don't do anything.
Yeah, I guess on that final closing remark on that point is that getting to a proper analytics setup is, in any case that I would know of, an iterative process. So you will not start. I mean, you can do a lot of preparation. You can get kind of a good start, but like it will not be perfect from the beginning. Accept this fact, as everything in life. Accept this fact and start with something, as Mark said, and then kind of iterate from there. Stay curious, and I guess then you're good.
Awesome. By the way, one more thing at the end I want to plug here is Customlytics. They made a great guide called Mobile Developers Guide, which I think is a great resource if you, in general, want to get a broad overview over like all the different aspects of mobile apps. And I was also sent this via email in the wrap up, so to say. And I recommend that you get your copy for this guide. I think it's a great resource.
Thank you. Nice to see that that month of my life was invested wisely.
Okay, awesome. Then have a nice day, and thank you all for being here. And bye.
Talk soon. Stay safe,
Thank you.
guys. Thank you. Bye bye.
Good luck, everyone.